Good day everybody, welcome back to our sessions in teaching methods of English. Today we are going to concentrate on Unit 7, which is focused on teaching writing. Here are some of the points that we're going to cover. 1. We're going to look at the principles that have been suggested on how to teach. We are going to look at the principles that are suggested that we should consider when teaching writing. 2. Principles that you have to consider when you are developing writing tasks. 3. We look briefly at the terms transactional and expressive writing, like what are they and how do they fit into teaching writing. And we'll look at 2 approaches of teaching writing, namely process and product writing. 5th, we are going to look at the writing objectives and competencies that have been stipulated in the syllabus. 6th, phases of teaching writing, pre, during, and post writing. 7, we will look at the aspect of providing feedback to the learners on their writing. 8, we'll look at some examples of scoring rubrics, self or peer evaluations. 9, we will then look at the role that grammar plays in writing. And last but not least, we will look at the assessment of writing. And when we are talking about assessment, we are looking at the NSSC examination in particular. Alright, let's start with our first point, the principles of for teaching writing, and these are provided by Dr. David Noonan, and it's found in the book called Teaching English to Speakers of Other Languages, TESOL. The book is about that. First, we're going to look at the 4 principles for teaching now, principles that you have to consider when you are teaching writing. And there are 4 principles that have been provided. The first one is understand your learner's reason for writing. The second is providing many opportunities for the learners to write. 3rd, make feedback helpful and meaningful. And last but not least, clarify for yourself and your learners how their writing will be evaluated. So let's look at these principles in more detail. Now let's look at the first principle, which is understanding your learner's reason for writing. The first point that is made is that when there is no coordination or there is no match between what the writing goals the teacher has and the writing goals or objective the learners have, this causes frustration or even dissatisfaction. Alright, so it is very important that the learners are aware of what their goals in a specific classroom are. Alright, what are they expected to do in the classroom? And it's also important for the teacher to know how the activities that they are doing in the classroom relate back to the syllabus. Here they say there should be awareness of how writing course subject fits into the rest of the curriculum. In other words, for us, as teachers, we don't really look so much at the syllabus, but we look at the curriculum rather. We do not look so much at the curriculum, but rather on the syllabus. So it's good for you to know now the activities that you are doing in the classroom. How do they relate back? How do they fit into the syllabus? Do you understand? The syllabus is our guide when it comes to teaching. And it's really good for you to familiarize yourself with the syllabus of teaching English. And you need to know what type of writing the learners are expected to do in the classroom. Are they going to do technical writing, such as, report writing? Are they going to, or Or is the writing component largely intended to support oral language development or mastery of grammar? And all this information of what is expected the learners to learn is in the syllabus. You see that it's a combination basically of all this development of language, let's say oral, reading. It's like all these skills are supposed to work together in sync to help the learners develop their language, be it oral like spoken, or written. All right, and you can get more information of this in the syllabus. And when you are aware of what type of writing that the learners are expected to do, then it will save you time from covering or doing activities that are not necessary, or they are not supporting the learners to attain the objectives that are stipulated in the syllabus. Let's move on to the next principle, which is provide many opportunities for the learners to write. So this principle basically reflects the philosophy of learning by doing, which means in the classroom, the learners should not just simply be listening to you, talking or teaching them the different types of writing without necessarily practicing. So in other words, the learners need to practice writing. As the saying goes, the more you practice something, the better you become. So the idea is for us to give the learners, or for you when you go and work with your learners, give them as many opportunities to practice writing as possible. And this basically goes in hand with the idea that we can improve our speaking by having a lot of practice in speaking, so as for us to improve, or for the learners to improve their writing skills, they need to be provided as many chances for them to practice writing. So the idea is not just to give them as many writing opportunities as possible without a chance of reflecting on the process of their writing. And there should also be feedback that is accompanying the different or the many opportunities that the learners are practicing their writing. To put it in other words, you need to ensure that when they finish a certain writing activity, you should provide them feedback. And also, in the process of writing, when they are doing the actual writing, give them a chance to reflect on what is happening during the writing. All right, and we'll talk more about this at the later stage. And there's also a point that we just don't give them the same type of writing, but we should give them a variety. And when you go back to the syllabus, you'll see that there are different kinds of writing that the learners are expected to know how to write. Do you get me? And then you should give them those type of writing, the varied type of writing in the classroom for them to practice. So in specific purpose of writing courses or subject, we call them subject in Namibia, the range of written genre, text type will be restricted and reflect the overall nature of the course. All right, and as I've mentioned, go to the syllabus, and the syllabus will guide you on what type of writing genres or what type of texts that the learners need to practice in the classroom. And then it's stated here that ideally learners should produce their drafts in their own time, let's say outside the classroom rather than in the classroom. You know that writing takes so much time, and we should give them a chance also to work more on their writing outside the classroom. And we'll see that depending on the approach that you are taking to teaching writing, let's say if it's process instead of product, or product instead of process, or if it's a combination, then the time limit is different, all right, for each type of approach that you're using. But in other words, you have to give the learners also a chance to work outside the classroom to finish their writing, since writing can be time consuming. And remember that we said that the writing should be accompanied by feedback, either from the teachers or the peers, or it should also, not all, but it should also be accompanied by reflection. All these type of activities do takes a little bit of time, and many at times we do not have enough time on our hands, so you may be required to have your learners work outside the classroom, and then use the time to reflect on the issues that most of the learners are facing and the guidance in the classroom. But it doesn't mean that they shouldn't write in the classroom. They should also get a chance to write in the classroom, but also you have them use their outside out of class time to do their. We are now moving on to the third principle, which is make feedback helpful and meaningful. When you are giving your learners feedback, it should be specific, and it should be specific directions on what the learners need to do or they should do in order for them to improve their writing. All right. The feedback shouldn't just be about how well they are doing, but it should also give them direction. They should give them guidance of how they can improve their writing. Feedback can be more meaningful by encouraging self-check, peer review that are guided by checklists, which the teacher need to provide ahead of time. These direct the learners to specific aspects on their writing. So what do we mean by this exactly? When it comes to giving feedback, you shouldn't be the only one giving the learners feedback. Do you understand? You should involve them in the process of feedback provision, whereby you have them self-evaluate. Do you understand? They should self-check of their progress. Or you could have their peers review their work. But then for this review, either self or done by the peers, it should be accompanied by a checklist that is guiding them on what they should look out for when they are either looking at their own writing or when they are looking or evaluating, assessing their partners or their classmates' work. There should be a checklist to guide them. And we'll talk about feedback a little bit later. As you have seen from the points that we say we're going to cover, feedback is also part of it. And then as I'm going to explain the different aspects that we are going to cover, feedback is mentioned there. The last but not least principle provided by Noonan is that clarify for yourself and your learners how their writing will be evaluated. Here it says that in addition to determining how well the learners have done, it also involves making judgment about why they have performed well on some objectives and not so well on others. This is simply to say that when it comes to evaluating the learners, you just don't, I think I've already mentioned this point earlier, that you shouldn't just look at how well the learners are doing or how terribly they are doing, but you should also include the process of why are they really performing terribly in certain activities or tasks, right? When it comes to covering certain objectives, and why are they not doing so well? So why are they doing well in some objectives or the tasks? And to attain objectives, it's going to depend highly on the type of tasks that you give them. Why are they doing very well on some tasks? All right. And then why are they doing terribly in some tasks? And that means that now why attaining certain objectives is not achieved, right, for them. And for this to happen, for this type of thinking or reflection to happen, or judgment or assessment to happen, you need to involve your learners in the process of assessment. And this can be done through self-assessment or self-evaluation. All right. And here in the self-assessment and self-evaluation, the learners really guided by the questions that you ask them, they should reflect on why am I, let's say, terrible at writing formal letters. All right. And this could be, now when they think about it, this could be because they were not well trained before, because they are grade 10 to 12, let's say, and by now they should know, you would think that they should know how to write a letter. And then when you ask them good questions to really reflect on this, it will guide them, it will have them discover why they are not good at doing, achieving certain objective or doing certain tasks. That can be done now through self-assessment. In any kind of assessment or evaluation, it's very important that the learners are aware of the criteria being used to judge their work. That is to say, you need to tell the learners ahead of time before they start writing on how are they going to be assessed, what is going to be included in the assessment, which means that the criteria that you use for assessment should be said clearly. They should know straight away what you are going to assess when they are writing, so that when they write, they try by all means to include all these aspects that you're going to evaluate them on. For example, we have, are you going to give weight on creativity? Is their creativity going to be graded? Is it going to be scored? Are you going to focus on accuracy of their grammar? Are you going to measure their spelling? Are you going to look at their punctuation? Are you going to include in your assessment their imagination? Are you going to evaluate that? And are you going now to also look at the ability to follow the generic structure of a text? So let's say if it's narrative, essay, are you going to look at their structure? Are you going to measure their structure, or is it all the above? Or what specific components of their writing are you going to assess? And let's say if you are looking at all this, then you give them weight. How much weight are you going to give, let's say, creativity, accuracy of grammar, spelling, punctuation, if those are the things that you're going to look at? All right. You need to specifically state that for the learners to know. If all the above, are you going to give equal weights for each criteria, or are you going to give them different weights? So all this needs to be stated at the very beginning so that the learners are not going to be surprised. By looking at this, it means that you as a teacher, you just don't show up to class. You need to prepare. You need to spend a lot of time to prepare for, let's say, the checklist or the marking grades that you need to give your learners before they start writing. It helps quite a lot with the expectations, from the learners, like the expectations of what they need to include in their letters. All right. So do not disadvantage your learners, but rather give them a chance to do so, to prepare well, to cover the points that you want them to cover when they are writing. We are moving on to our next point, the second point, which is principles of devising writing tasks. And we are looking at these principles from the 7 assumption of writing, which was provided by Hedge 1988. It's written a long time ago, but it's still applicable. And we have gotten this information from our module, Teaching Method Module 2, Unit 5, on pages 86 to 94. The first assumption stipulates that classroom tasks need to reflect the ultimate goal of enabling learners, here it says students, but learners, to write whole text which form connected and contextualized and appropriate pieces of communication. So that is to say now that when the learners are doing whatever activity that you give your learners, it should be a whole type of writing which has a context and it's written with the purpose of communicating. Don't just focus in a writing class, don't just focus at the sentence level whereby you'll be asking your learners to, let's say, change active sentences into passive sentences. Do you understand? Like, you have to include, we need to focus more on having the learners write whole text where there is also a purpose for them to write, and that purpose should be a communicative purpose. So school writing should lead ultimately to whole texts which are connected, and that such text should have a context. Okay, I've already mentioned that. An example could be that when you give them a writing task, it should be, let's say, you ask them to write a letter that will accompany an application form for a bursary, for instance. Right? There's a context, which is application for a bursary. It could be in a school realm, or it could be outside the school when they finish. Let's say when they complete their high school, they will need to write application form to get funding for their studies, for instance. So there you can see that there's a context, and it's going to be a whole text, and it's going to be communicative because they are writing to get funding, and that is communicative. Do you get what I mean? So those are the type of writing that we should consider when we are teaching our learners. It may take longer to mark, but the additional effort is worth it in terms of preparing the learners to write the kind of text they need for school or life outside the classroom. As you have seen, as we have covered, the syllabus, we are not just training our learners for the examination, but we are also training them to be functional citizens. And when they become citizens, we have, chances of doing the writing. All right. And when they finish high school, they'll be expected to write longer texts. So this is just a preparation for them, not just for the examination, but for real life as well. The second assumption stipulates that students need to get a chance to practice different kind of writing where they have different forms and different function. And when they get this chance, this is related back to the principle of Noonan. All right, we need to give them as many chances to practice different kind of writing, and when we give them this chance, they get to develop their skills that are needed. To write good texts. And then teachers cannot simply assume that the students know how to write a certain type of text that you expect them to write. So in other words, do not assume that since the students are in grade 10, for instance, or grade 11, they should know how to write a report, or they should know how to write a letter. Do not assume that. Do you understand? But rather, before you expect them to write a certain text, you can do activities that will get them to see the different characteristics of the type of writing that they are going to write. So if it's a report, how is a report written? How does it look like? They should do activities that will get them to see these different features of the type of writing that they are going to write. So, or if it's a letter, what are the different components that the letter has? So those are the things that you need to include in your classroom. Don't assume. Train them first and then have them practice the actual writing of the type of text that you have exposed them to. Here's an example again. If you were to teach report writing, for example, you could bring in a model of a report with which learners would work, all right, doing, let's say, sequencing activities, identifying features of the text through matching exercises and so on. I've already also mentioned that what you should do, a little bit about that. And then in order to raise awareness about the structure of the report, so expose them first before you ask them to produce. That is the assumption here. And then learners need to be familiarized with certain common discourse patterns. Activities which help learners to understand the patterns in the text are likely to help them produce their own texts. So this is again an iteration of what I have already mentioned. Expose them so that they see before they start writing. And I think we need to do this for the Namibian context. We really need to do a little bit more of practicing, teaching them the different components. Like if it's an informal letter, what are the components of an informal letter? If it's a blog, how does the blog look like? And what are the features of a blog? You need to teach them these characteristics first before you have them do the writing. Third assumption. It is stated that classroom writing tasks need to be set up in a way that reflects the writing process in good writers. We need to encourage our students to go through the process of planning, organizing, composing, and revising. So this is called the process writing. Remember, I said that we're going to look at product versus process writing. And this is the process writing. And all good writers, they go through these steps where they have to organize, they need to plan, and then they need to compose their writing, and then they need to revise their writing. That's why even in your assignments, you are encouraged to work ahead of time so that you have a chance to do all these steps to produce a good assignment. All right? We need to expose our learners also in the same way in the process of writing well. This approach to writing is often referred to the process writing since the emphasis on the whole process of producing a text instead of stressing only of the end product. We just don't want, let's say, writing a formal letter, like as in we are not only going to focus on mainly the final product, but we also have to have the learners think about this whole process, to reflect on this process and teach them this process so that they become good writers. Here we're going to look at the 3 stages of writing process. And remember that we don't only have these 3 stages. It depends on who have created the steps. They are in a way similar, but then people arrange them or write them differently. Some of them you find that the stages are very simple, like this. There are only 3, but for some, like another example that we're going to look at later, it has 13 steps that the learners need to follow in their writing process, and it's different, right? Or it's the same. The process is the same, but it's termed differently. All right, people that term these stages differently, but the idea is basically the same, whereby the learners are expected to rehearse or pre-write, and then they are expected to do the first draft, and then next they are expected to revise before they submit the final product. Here's an example now by Murray that, for instance, in the first stage, which is rehearsing or pre-writing, what the learners are expected is to find a topic. And finding a topic, okay, you can give them a chance to find a topic on their own, but it might be wiser, so that they don't waste too much time, that they find, you provide them a topic. All right, you can give them that liberation of finding their own topic, but at times you may need to give them a topic. They find a topic, and then they find ideas about the topic. All right, and then think about the topic and letting ideas interact and develop and organize themselves. So when they think about all these different ideas, let's say they have brainstormed different ideas, then they look at them and see how are they going to arrange them when they are doing they're performing, or when they are writing. How are they going to arrange them? They just look at how they connect. And the last part, think about the audience and the purpose of the writing task. The audience and the purpose always influence the register and the content that needs to be involved. So they have to think about that. If it's a text that is written for a friend, it's definitely going to be different from a text that is written for, let's say, for a job. All right, that when somebody is applying a formal letter to apply for a job, the content and the register that is going to be used is definitely going to be different. All right. The next step, which is the drafting, Here now is the process of getting the ideas down on the paper. And you can see that now they are starting to write something. Before they were just thinking, brainstorming. They can write down, but it's not the actual text that they are writing. It's just ideas, all right, in the rough paper. And here now they need to put all these ideas on a paper. And writers may go back to stage 1 to look for further ideas and rethink what he or she really wants to say. In other words, when it comes to these stages, it's not linear that, okay, when you are done with the rehearsing part, then it doesn't mean that now you are done for good, you cannot go back. This process is not linear. Like you need to go from stage 1, 2, and 3. But at times you may need to go back to stage 1, for instance, while you're still doing stage 2 of drafting. Or you could be in stage 3 and then coming back again here to really change certain things on the written text. The last but not least, the last stage is revising, which involves the redrafting of a text, which means going back and then rewriting or, redrafting the text. And then it also involves evaluating what has been written. All right, it's in the revising stage. Making deletions and additions as necessary, which means you might need to go back to stage 1 again, get other ideas that you want to add to the text because you have deleted some. And then improving the original task. So the idea is really to have the learners now improve the first draft. So this is a second draft, for instance, and depending on the amount of time they have, they can go to the third, and then they submit. All right, and then they submit for evaluation. So when it comes now to these different types of stages, this approach to writing, which is a writing process, it may take time, but then the amount of time that is going to be spent on one text is very dependent on the purpose. Why are they writing this text and who is the audience? I think we've spoken about that. So if it's, let's say, an application for a job or an application for a certain committee, or then obviously the learners will need to take so much time to write that letter. All right, because there's so much at stake, and the purpose also. But if it's a little note that is going to a friend, it's not going to take so much time. It's going to be, to the point, simple and informal. It will not take as much time. So that's an example. And then learners need to be taken through these steps, which are part of the real life process of writing. In real life, they are going to have to apply for jobs. In real life, if they have a job, they might be required to write reports. And to come up with now the final report, they need to go through this whole process, come up with ideas, combine them, make a first draft, have somebody read it, and then change, reflect on the writing, do you understand, before they submit the final report that they need to give to their boss. All right, the process writing is not the only way to teach writing. We have got the product writing as well. And we need to train our learners on how to write using the product process. And the product process is basically similar to the conditions that are of the examination or test or test. Do you understand? Where in a test you don't have a chance to go through the process of brainstorming all your ideas and doing the first draft and the second draft and then the final draft. No, you don't have that. You have restricted time. So you need to also train your learners on how to write in such conditions, because they're going to write the examination after all, and they're just not we are just not simply preparing them for the real life, but also preparation for the tests and examination. Give additional practice to help them practice to write faster and not only fluent, but under strict time, because it's real. They are going to write the examination at the end of the year. They will be needing to write tests somehow, throughout the year, the different semesters that they're going to cover. Fourth assumption is, now we're moving on to the fourth assumption. It's stipulated that when setting writing tasks, teachers need to vary their audience, identify who the readers are to be, and try to make every piece of writing fulfill some kinds of communicative purpose. We need to learn to teach our learners to write with the purpose of communication. All right, and then with the purpose of communication, and we have to have them practice writing for different audiences because the audience affect the language that they're going to use and the register. I've already mentioned that. So you need to have them, practice various text with various audience and various purposes. I've already, or somehow I've mentioned that, but let's just read it. Purpose and audience are key consideration in pieces of real life writing. You always have to, it's related before. It's related to a point that I've mentioned before, that in real life, we are preparing our learners to write for real life. And in real life, the purpose and the audience do have an effect on how and the type of text that So it is only natural that one should try to build this in the classroom writing tasks so that they will be prepared for the real life. The audience and purpose, affect the writing, content and register. We've already stated that. Assumption 5. It is stated that the process of marking, with its traditional focus on error correction by the teacher, needs review and modification into a range of activities involving learners as well as the teacher, thus making revision an integral part of the process writing. What does that mean exactly? When it comes to marking or giving feedback for the learners, we've already stated that earlier when we were looking at the principles of teaching reading and writing by Noonan, that we should involve our learners in the process of evaluating their work. All right, and then when you are teaching them here, when they are involved, they get into the process of reflecting. Really, why am I doing terribly in this activity? Why am I so good? How do I share this with other students or with my colleagues, with other learners, so that they improve? Like, when we involve them in such process, they really get to learn, either learn for themselves or learn from others in the process of their own writing. Right? And then this is really like a good practice for you to do. Don't just focus on error correction. It should go beyond error correction. So as stated here, involve the learners in the revising, the editing of their own work so that the activity known as marking becomes part of their writing process and genuine source of learning for both the learners and the teacher. Not only the learners get to learn, but also the teacher gets to learn from the learners also as well. That's why it's important for you to include them in the process of evaluating, because there is the aspect of learning for both of you, the teacher and the learners. And you give them autonomy, you empower them when you do that. Like, they know that they are taking ownership of their own learning when they're involved in such tasks as evaluating their own work or their peers' work. Assumption 6. Learners need time in the classroom for writing. The teacher's task is to select and design activities which support them through the process of producing a piece of writing. Earlier, I've stated that we should give the learners also to do writing outside the classroom, but we should also have them do the practice in the classroom to support them in the writing process. And as we have said, we do not just assume that the learners know how to write this certain types of text, but we should expose them to those different types of text, and that exposure will happen in the classroom, and then you teach them, you guide them, you scaffold their writing process. Give the learners time to work in the classroom, even though our tendency is to give the writing as homework. Here you also get to see who is writing, who is struggling when they are doing it in the classroom, and how to help them. So you should strike a balance between giving work for outside the classroom as well as writing work in the classroom. Assumption 7, which is our last assumption, it states that collaborative writing in the classroom generates discussion and activities which encourage effective writing process. And not all pieces of writing need to be collaborative. Okay, we need to know that we just don't ask the learners to work in groups and pairs, but some type of writing needs to be done individually. And here, when we're talking about collaborative work, generating good discussions and activities that will help them in the writing process. An example could be, it's true, an example could be when they are working with a team, for example, they brainstorm of different ideas. Let's say the type of text that they need to write, the topic is on mental health. Maybe one student does not know much about mental health, but it's likely that one or two other teammates will know about mental health. They will know about the topic that they're going to discuss. So they come together, they generate different ideas. But then when it comes to the actual writing, they have to write first on their own, and then somebody needs to review what they have written, but at least they have gotten ideas that they need when they're writing. Right? It's possible that the learners know the structure, let's say, of a letter, but they don't have ideas. But when they discuss, they do that. Or it could be that some have ideas, but they don't know the structure. But when they come together and work together, they get to produce, to come up with ideas that will help them in the process of writing. So the idea is the process writing together generates discussion and can certainly help learners produce more coherent and more accurate pieces of writing. They will help each other in the process of, okay, how do you now make your writing more coherent? Like they work on that first before they submit their last piece, because they get assistance with a checklist that will guide them on how to arrange their writing in such a way that is coherent and cohesive. All right, coherent, cohesive, and very understandable. We are quickly going to look at now the third point, which is transactional writing versus expressive writing. Transactional writing and expressive writing are the type of writings that we need to include in our own classrooms. Transactional writing is the type of writing that we usually do in our classrooms and basically in life. And this writing is intended to get something done. For instance, you get to inform people, tell them what they need or what we think they ought to know. All right, we use transactional writing to inform people. We use it to advise or persuade or instruct people. We use it to record facts. All right. We use it to exchange opinions. We use it to explain or explore ideas, construct theories, to transact businesses, to conduct campaigns, to change public opinion. We have so many examples of transactional writing. This is the writing that we typically do in most of our classrooms and also in the real life, in the real world. All right, in real life, we do this type of writing. Expressive writing, on the other hand, is the type of writing that is focused on expressing our feelings or showing what we think and feel. So this is the type of writing that we are concentrating on here. We should not just focus mainly on the transactional writing, but we should also include expressive writing. This is done in many countries that have English, for example, as the medium of instruction or as a native language. But in many of our classrooms, we tend to not focus on this. But then if you go back to the syllabus, you can see that expressive writing is also part of the type of writing that you need to have your learners practice. And we'll see that a little bit later when we look at the syllabus. And it's very much close to a speech. The nature is very much similar to spoken language that is not as formal, for instance, as the transactional writing. So pitch many times is not very formal. It's a little bit more formal and more loose. There's more chance for people to use language that is very understandable, that is commonly used when we speak. And then it might be regarded as the first draft of writing. When you are writing the first draft, you really don't care so much about accuracy, the structure, the spelling. You don't worry so much about those, but you just put ideas on the page. So expressive writing is somewhat, similar to that, and can be used to explore thoughts. I've already said that, like thinking out loud, and then you write it. Like your writing will be so much similar to, when you are thinking out loud. And it's characterized by informality, expression of feelings and attitude. Like it's more informal than the formal that happens in transactional writing. And then not usually for the audience, for the self. You write expressive writing, sometimes you do it not for somebody else, but for yourself. And let's say, as an example that we'll look at later, in a diary. Right? It's not usually done for somebody else to read, but it's done for yourself. And then it helps learners grapple with concepts, thoughts, knowledge in a mode that is meaningful to themselves without having to worry about accuracy of language or structure. I've already mentioned this point of, not worrying too much about accuracy. And then so when we are saying grapple here is, we are talking about grappling. It's more of, getting time to understand something. So if, let's say there's a concept of death and you don't understand that, through this expressive writing, you get to know because you are questioning yourself and you are trying to answer. So that's what grapple means. So when we want to understand certain concept or thoughts or knowledge, then we use expressive writing to get a better understanding of those aspects. Good. Since we say that expressive writing is not something that we commonly include in our lessons, how do we then include it in our lesson? One of the methods that you can use to have your learners write expressively is through journals. Here you have to decide beforehand, when they're writing these journals, is it a learning journal that you may need to read later? Is it a personal journal that you may not need necessarily to read of details, but you have to see if they have done the actual writing of the journals? You have to agree, decide beforehand. Are you going to read their journals or not? And then writing journals many times is not assessed, but you could assess them. It could be another way for learners to accumulate points, for instance. Then you can do that kind of assessment, but not necessarily focusing on their grammar and accuracy. If you want to, you could assess, but usually it's not assessed. Another way of including or having learners write expressively is through free writing. Writing without stopping for a certain period of time. That is to say, you tell them, I'll give you 5 minutes, and then you can write on a certain topic, for instance. Do you understand? And then they just write for the 5 minutes, and without really worrying so much about accuracy of their language or their structure. I have already mentioned that no worries for spelling, grammar, punctuation errors, but you just put their ideas down. And this is a good activity that they can do before they start doing the actual writing. And then get words on the page. It involves just getting words on the page. And it can lead to drafting process. Let's say if it's a topic on, let's say, love, that expressed writing could be done for literature. It could be a short story, it could be poetry, it could be an article for magazine, because many times magazine articles are not as formal, so it can be accepted in a magazine article. We're now moving on to the fourth aspect, which is on process and product writing approach to writing. Process-oriented approach focus on the procedures involved in arriving to the final product. This procedures are thinking, planning, drafting, revising that the writer engages in, when they are to arrive to an acceptable text. And we have already spoken about process writing, like the different stages, right? So this is basically what this point is about. In the process-oriented classroom, learners spend a great deal of time engaged in activities other than the writing. And remember, we are not only looking at the final product where the learners need to write the final product, but we look at the rehearsing part, the thinking part, first part where they have to brainstorm ideas, have ideas, connect, and then start writing. We just don't focus on writing, but on those steps as well. It is suggested that when we are teaching our learners to write, we can follow the 13 steps provided here and to guide them to write their final text. The first step is learners engage in discussion as a whole class and in small groups and pairs. And I think I've already told you that in the first step, there's the brainstorming part where the learners need to discuss their ideas first before they engage into their writing. So these are just steps that you can follow in your own class when you want to employ the process writing approach to your teaching. The second point is that the learners then need to brainstorm, make notes, and ask questions regarding the topic that they have to address or the type of text that they need to work on. Third, they then do a fast writing. All right, it can be similar to the expressive writing. They do a fast writing, selecting ideas and establishing a viewpoint without worrying so much about any errors that they'll make with their spelling, the grammar, and punctuations. And fourth, they, based on their first expressive part, where they write down all these ideas on the paper, rough paper, then they can use that to make their own first rough draft. After they finish their first draft, then they need to carry out a preliminary evaluation of what they have written, if what they've written really makes sense or not. Sixth, they then focus on the arrangement of the information and the structure of the information. First is just like evaluating, is this, and the fifth point, is this information really useful? How is it, like, how does it sound? Is it good? And then on the sixth step, then they need to arrange the information, like what comes in the first paragraph, or what comes in the introduction, what comes in the first, in the second paragraph, what comes in the third, fourth, and what comes into the conclusion. Like they can make that kind of arrangement, and then if they need more information, they can go back and get extra information. Produce now their first draft. Okay, in 4, we'll call it a rough draft. It's not really the first draft. Nobody needs to read that rough draft. In the 7th step, that's when now they write the first draft. And when they write the first draft, what we'll consider first draft, they can work with a partner or with a group to review, to evaluate, to assess their writing, and then they need to respond. And for the learners to carry out this part of evaluating other people's work, as I've mentioned earlier, provide the learners with a checklist on aspects that they need to focus on when they are reading or evaluating other classmates' work. 9, learners take part in a conference discussing their drafts and deciding on what changes to make as they produce a second draft. In the 8th part, the learners will give their papers to their partners, for instance, and then their partners look at this draft with the checklist to guide them on what to look at. And after they have done that, they come back to the person whose paper they have evaluated. They sit down and then they talk about the changes that they need to make, or things that they love about their colleagues or their partners' work. The person who is writing then decide, from this feedback that I have gotten from the conference, what do I keep? What do I remove? 10, write their second draft. And 11, the writer self-evaluate the second draft, focusing on accuracy through proofreading and editing. Again, for the learners to evaluate themselves, you need to provide them a checklist to guide them with their evaluation. Like, what do they need to look at? For example, okay, does text, let's say they are writing an essay, does the text have all the paragraphs? Let's say you ask them to write a 5-paragraph essay. Does it have all this paragraph? Does it have an introduction? And is the text really an introduction covering the 3 points that are covered in the body? Does it have a conclusion, reiterating the important aspects mentioned in the body? Each paragraph, does it concentrate on one idea? Like each of the 3 paragraphs, do they all have individual ideas? Do you understand? And then you can have a checklist, and then they check, okay, if these points are in, then they check. If something is missing, then they go back to review their draft to ensure that those things that are stipulated in the checklist are there before it's graded finally. 12, finished draft is produced, like the final one after they have done the checklist. And 13, the last step, peer readers provide a final response to the draft. You can have the learners either evaluate the final response, the final draft, all right, they respond on that, they can evaluate that, they check that, you provide them guidance on what they need to do there, or you can be the one doing the actual final evaluation that the learners have produced after that whole long process. Do you get what process writing is involved, right? It's a good process for learners to get used to, because these are the processes that you're supposed to do when you're writing your assignments. Maybe not so much having other people evaluate, but you can have other people proofread your assignment and then do the changes and then do the final draft, which you submit to your lecturer. As you can see from the 13 step procedures, the process approach requires writer to produce multiple drafts, getting feedback on successive drafts as they get closer to the desired final product. It requires a lot of writing over and over, and also getting feedback on what they are writing. It takes time. And we know that the reality is that in our classrooms, in public schools, we have so many students, and you cannot do all this evaluation by yourself. You can do it with the assistance of the learners, as long as you guide them on how to evaluate or check other people's work. If writing is done by hand rather than the computer, this can be extremely time consuming. Like, it takes up so much time and it's very tedious. So it is suggested that you help your learners get used to the idea of writing using word processor, using a computer, Microsoft Word, and then submit if it's possible. But then if it's not possible, unfortunately, they have to do it by hand. I mean, we are in the technology age. We have to get really learners get used to writing using processor. I bet there may be public libraries where they can type. There might be some centers where they can type and then print out their work or have them send it to you. It just depends. Yeah, it depends on the nature. But in reality, though, it might be a little bit impractical, but you just have to find ways. That's why it's suggested that you have to have learners not only write in the classroom, but also write outside the classroom. The process approach have been subjected to numerous criticism. Obviously, any approach that is stipulated, there's always somebody who's going to criticize it. One of these criticism is that while foster creativity and creative writing, it does not foster factual writing. But I do not agree with this. It's possible for the learners to write factual writing, the transactional writing, still using this process. But you just have to use your good judgment of what points or how many drafts you want your learners to complete. It's really possible to do factual writing too, but it's just a criticism. I mean, they're entitled to their criticism. Not surprisingly, left to select their own subject, young writers tend to choose personal narratives. That's why I say that when it comes to the topics and the types of writing that they need to do, you as a teacher needs to be involved by finding the topic first and then assigning them the type of text that they need to complete. All right, in fact, personal writing and rooting the writing in personal experiences are encouraged, and we have seen that through when we were looking at transactional writing and expressive writing. We are told, and it's required, and it's stated in the syllabus that the learners need to do expressive, personal writing as well. Learners need structure. They need models to practice. They need to improve even mechanical skills, and they need time to think through their ideas, to revise them, and to write for real purpose and real audience. This is a reality. That's why we need to practice the process writing, because it helps them go through the processes that they are going to be required to do in real life. All right, they need models. We have spoken about that. Don't just assume that they know how to write this type of writing, but they need to see, how is this type of writing? If it's a report, how do we really write a report? How does it look like? What are the features of a report? Now we are moving on to product writing. Product-oriented approach focuses on the final product, that is the final text that the writers will produce. In product, we have already mentioned that in product, it focuses on the final text that the learners are going to create. The learners spend so much of their time studying and then imitating the model types provided by the teacher or the textbook. You have to show them the model of, let's say, a report or a formal letter or informal letter. How does it look like? What are the features of the type of writing that they need to do? And then what they need to do now is just produce, following this model, their own text. The ideas might be their own ideas in that, but then the text type, the features of that text that they are going to produce will be similar to what they have been provided by the teacher or stated in the textbook. Teachers concentrate on ensuring grammatical accuracy at the sentence level, the sentence being seen as the basic building block of the text. It's like you have to ensure, like from the very beginning, they need to worry about grammatical accuracy. They need to worry about making sure that their sentences are accurate from the get-go. And the sentences were written, and this is where the whole text is going to be built on. And then going into paragraphs, and then paragraphs into a whole text. Proponents of the process approach argue that the product approach is mechanical and cripples the creativity of the learners. And remember that when you have only one chance to write this text, you don't get to write another draft. It becomes really crippling. You are worried. Sometimes you want to be perfect in your writing, that it takes up so much time. You don't get to write much. You are going back and then erasing. Do you understand? So those are some of the criticism that this product approach is given. And then it also inhibits creativity. The learners are not as creative. The product-oriented approach is text-based form approach, which focuses on a form, gives text to students to imitate, and usually use textbook, which gives a range of models. I think we have already mentioned that. We're just reiterating. And then the teachers have the obligation to correct and, if possible, to eliminate the students' errors. It's a traditional approach, like you really focus so much on the errors, in which students are encouraged to mimic the model, which is usually presented and analyzed at the earlier stage. Before they start writing, you have to work on the model, and then they need to imitate this model. Exercises and language use are provided to the students, and bottom-up approach is followed from sentence to paragraph to text level. So that is now to say that what kind of language are they going to include in their text. So if it's comparative, you have to work with the learners before they start writing on comparative language. They need to do an activity on comparative language. How do you write comparative structure? And then if it's, let's say it's a blog, then you have to work on the structure of a blog. What does a blog include? They look at all these features, and then they have to follow the same features. They just need to imitate. Some ideas are theirs, but then there's a certain structural components, like the structure of sentences, how they need to look like, all that they are guided on. Teachers assign papers and basically attend to the clarity, originality, correctness of the final product without attending to the writing process or to the writers themselves. So the focus is more on that final text that the learners need to produce. It's never on the process when they're writing, and it's never so much about the learners themselves. So here are some of the 4 stages that you can follow when you're using the product approach. 1, model texts are given and read, and the features of the genre are highlighted. So you have to look at the type of text that you're going to look at, all these features that you want the learners to include in their text, you need to have them be aware of these features. Second, learners do controlled practice of the highlighted features. So for example, if you want them to do comparative language in their essay, then they do activities on comparative language so that they get comfortable with this type of structure. And then if it's a blog, the different type of features of a blog, maybe you can cut the blog into little pieces and then you have them arranged in the correct order of how the blog should look like, so that they really get used to be aware of the features that they need to include in their own writing. Third, learners organize their ideas, which is very important and final. They need to organize their ideas. And then last but not least, they produce the end product mostly individually and rarely collaboratively. And we see that collaboration is done quite a lot in the process writing, but in product, not so much, because they are just focusing on that one text that they need to produce. And then they need to now produce that final product. And then they do this by choosing from a choice of comparable tasks. It's like they already have a task that they need, like they are guided quite a lot of what they need to include in that final product. To conclude this section of process and product writing, we need to understand that these approaches are not opposing each other. They are not oppositions, but rather they are complementary. When we are teaching, we don't have to say that this one process is better than the other, but you can actually you can combine both of them, choosing from the process, a few steps from the process, and then focusing on the accuracy also on the product. To understand they can work together, but you just have to decide what steps from the process are you choosing and what steps from the product way approach of writing are you going to use in your classroom. There is no reason why both approaches can be integrated in the writing class. I think this is a point that I have just mentioned. In the same way as accuracy and fluency oriented activities are integrated in speaking. In speaking, we just don't say that we want them to be fluent, but they need to be accurate also. And then when it comes to reading, we just don't say that we are looking at intensive writing, but we also have to look at extensive writing. So these are just examples to emphasize that both approaches need to be used in the classroom. Don't just pick one. Teachers should be flexible and depending on the characteristics and the problems of each and every learning situation. So you need to be flexible, and then what you're going to choose as the way you are going to teach writing, it will depend on the situation in which you are. Sometimes you might choose pure process, sometimes you might choose pure product, sometimes you need to combine them, but it just depends on the situation in which you find yourself. And teachers they have to select the approach or make a combination of the approaches that will meet the learner's needs when it comes to writing. No one approach should be regarded as panacea, so which means that we shouldn't consider that this one approach is the only solution to the writing problem.